Good afternoon. My name is Terry Tennant, CEO of SAFE. It is really good to have you with us this afternoon. I am delighted to have Professor Kate Woodthorpe from the Centre for Death and Society, the University of Bath. Welcome, Kate. It's good to have you.
Hello, Terry. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today on this gorgeously hot day.
Kate's been a good friend to SAFE over the years, and we've interacted on a number of things. Congratulations to you for recently becoming professor of the university. That's quite an acclaim, so well done you. And this is such an important topic that you're looking at, deceased people's wishes and family disputes. And we were just talking before, there's a hidden skill set that isn't told, and we're really excited about what you're going to bring to us. I'm going to hand over to you now, and then we can do some Q&A at the end. Over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Terry, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is absolutely boiling hot here in Bath. I'm slowly melting in my office with my coffee, I don't know if you see it. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time out of your busy days to listen in. Like Terry said, I'm a new professor at Bath. I've been here about 15 years. I've done lots of work over that time on funeral costs, funeral practice, on the social fund, the devolution of policy areas to Scotland, the CMA. I was one of their expert witnesses, and more recently with the Law Commission and their first phase of their consultation on burial and grave reuse. So today I'm here to talk about a piece of work that we are doing to submit to the Law Commission to help inform the third phase of their legislative review in England and Wales. And we've just discovered that this slide has randomly gone. So I'm just going to talk you through what would have been on it. But just to say, I plan to talk for maybe 20-25 minutes maximum, and then I'd really like to hear what you think. And I will be keeping an eye on the chat. And I'm very happy to respond during the presentation or leave it to the end. It's absolutely fine. We'll just see if you feel like firing off some questions as I'm chatting. I have, just to say also, I have loved doing this research. I really, really loved it. I've been in my happy place. And I think that is because I can see the value and importance of funerals and what funeral directors and arrangers do behind the scenes. And I want to make that public and visible. But I also recognise that that bereaved consumers are changing, and I think there's a lot coming down the line at you. So I think part of today is talking about the project that we're doing, but it's these bigger kind of trends and changes within the sector that we're speaking to as well. So this project was funded by the social Policy Support Fund within the University of Bath. That's where I'm located. It's me, my colleague Diana Tedji, who's a lecturer here at Bath, Matt Crawley, who is a professional doctorate student and also the new CEO of the ICCM, that's the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Management, and Ed Curtin-Darling, who is from Bristol Law School. And we have conducted interviews with 21 pre-need and at-need providers between March and May, for which SAFE helped us to recruit. So thank you very much, SAFE and Terry, for your help in doing that. And this is part of the deal, is I would come back and tell you some of the preliminary findings. So I'm in the middle of writing up the report to submit to the Law Commission, and we want to get some academic papers out of this as well, which we will then be able to share and promote. But I wanted to say also that I'm very happy to come and talk to you separately again, whether it's regional or local parts of your organisation or any magazines. I'm happy to write things, because I think some of the things that will come out today are really important in terms of validation for you guys, in terms of hearing the value of what you do, but also recognising some of the challenges that you face and what is coming in the Law Commission in the third phase of their legislative review is the opportunity to make some of these points. So I'm sure you're all aware of this. The Law Commission are looking at a funeral legislation review in England and Wales. They've done part one. That's still being worked out. They're consulting on part two at the moment, which is on new technologies. And they're now in the pre-consultation phase for looking at whether deceased people's funeral wishes should have some kind of legal protection. And the pre-consultation phase means that they are talking to people. So they are talking to probably some of you on here, lots of other people across the sector, people like me and other academics. They're trying to work out what are the questions that we need to be asking in the consultation. What are the problems? What are the challenges? What can actually be rectified by the law? So we've done this study. They said that it would really help them to understand what goes on to on the front line to stop family disputes escalating, particularly when it comes to deceased people's wishes. So we've done this as an independent piece of work. It can't influence them in any way. They are very clear that they are completely independent, the Law Commission that is, but we are giving it to them as information. So we have done this research, and here you go, make of it what you will. So the preliminary findings we've split into two, around families and around funeral practice, and this is what I'm going to go through today. And I don't think any of this is going to be news to you. It is not going to be unusual. It's not going to come out of the blue, but I hope it stimulates some questions and some suggestions for ways forward to be able to either improve services, make efficiencies, to make the point to the Law Commission about some of the weaknesses in the system or vulnerabilities. So in terms of families, and I will talk about this at length, but families are increasingly complex. That is one of the big headline figures, things to take away. Findings from this study. We've got some really significant questions about who's a funeral for. I mean, this is probably unresolvable, but it does have very big implications for what is actually delivered by funeral professionals. And then we have challenges within the delivery of funerals in terms of what does wishes even mean. There's a massive spectrum of specificity, I've called it. There are some real challenges with the implementation of wishes, not least because you're picking up people at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're not able to do background checks because of the circumstances in which death occurs, and you step in or are called upon to step in. And all of this takes in it is a huge amount of emotional labour that goes on behind the scenes, and real resilience. And that's where I want to end the talk today, by really recognising the skill set that is required to do this job. And I couldn't do it. I really couldn't. And I think there is a lot more work to be done to make visible the skill set, and to really celebrate it, and make the case of this is why you need funeral professionals for people in these particular circumstances. So in terms of complex families, we know that families are changing, family structures and relationships are changing. We know that the biggest growth in family types are single households, particularly men in their 50s and 60s. This is from the census data. We know that half of all marriages and civil partnerships end in separation and divorce. We know that, I can't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but multiple, X percentage of people remarry or repartner, have multiple children by multiple people. And we also know that even within the most straightforward linear families, in terms of generations, the rise of what we call in sociology, so I'm a sociologist, what we call individualism, which has happened since the 1960s. And this is the idea, it's all about you, it's all about what the individual wants, individual fulfillment, your own advancement. The consequences of that are really significant in terms of people's expectations about who will step up for who, people's sense of obligation for who will, whether they will or will not step up for other people within their family. So it's not only that structures are changing, it's these invisible bonds that hold people together are changing. And that is no more pronounced than at the end of life. And funerals, it may also come out in weddings, these key ritual moments in people's lives, having children, where all sorts of these invisible expectations and obligations are suddenly blown apart, because you see people don't step up for each other. They will actively work against each other as well. You can no longer assume that just because you're part of a family that people will do the right thing. And that came out in the research that we did, because it's not even the fact that people will do the right thing, they have different views as to what doing the right thing constitutes. So a really good example of that was when looking at deceased people's wishes. There were cases that people were telling us about where there were two siblings, mother had died. One sibling was adamant that they followed the mother's wishes because that's what the mother wanted. Other sibling was adamant that they should do something else because that's what the family needed. Both of them were, morally equally valid, admirable, trying to do the right thing, but they were complete opposites. And that was when siblings got on, and they were trying to do the right thing, let alone for people who were, you know, deliberately sabotaging things, making life very difficult. There's lots of pre-existing tensions, fractures, and you add grief and money into the mix and death, and it explodes. And that came out quite a lot in interviews, this heady mixture of when someone dies and the situations that can unfold at speed as well. This is made ever more complex by the fact that there are so many decisions now to make around funerals. Even with direct cremation, there's masses of variations within the direct cremation offer. With more traditional funerals, there's enormous spectrum of opportunities, and the more decision points there are, the more opportunities there are for disagreements and that fracturing and the combustible nature of families to really just explode. And within all this, I think the backdrop is that families and the people, this is what people were telling us in the interviews, is that families are having to make decisions without much experience to fall back on, because they don't have lots of experience of organising funerals or even going to funerals. And they aren't able to make particularly well-informed decisions about the risks and benefits of particular options. And part of that is because most of the language around funerals, of the research that is done, is about cost, not actually about. There is some work on psychological benefit, but actually there isn't. Evidence suggests that the psychological benefit of a funeral is minimal. It is. I would be saying there is not much quality, robust evidence about this, about complex families, the relational opportunities, the ways of promoting and building relationships, bringing people together, the benefits in that way. There isn't any evidence there. So I think that is a real key finding for you to take forward, is thinking about, well, what evidence is needed, what would help us to make that case of why you need us, particularly for people who are doing more traditional funerals. The legal status of the next of kin hierarchy and who is family, this I find mind-boggling. That it is in law, in terms of intestacy rules. And this is where Ed is the specialist from the law school on the project. But all of that is predicated on people's good communication, being willing to communicate. People have very mixed understanding of what constitutes next of kin. There's a kind of common law assumption often in terms of gender and age and birth order, in terms of a hierarchy of family members. There's also the issue of the executor, if there's a will in place, and the executor's role, and that has been really fleshed out in Scotland, and I need to get to the bottom of that with what's going on in Scotland. But the challenge is that you guys aren't checking for wills, and it's not your job to be checking for wills. So it's all good and well having a will, but if people don't know it exists, and there's no mechanism at the moment to automatically be able to check for that when you register a death. So these systems don't speak to each other to make life easier to be able to identify people, to then determine who is the appropriate person to be taking responsibility for this funeral. And that's your situation is further complicated by the fact that pre-death there are all these other statuses that people may have, like power of attorney, various kind of advocacy roles that stop at the point of death, but people may still expect that they have that status within a family. So there is a lack of consistency pre-death and post-death, because all these kind of statuses die with the person, they end with the person. So there is an element, I guess, of education for people about, this will all end at the point of death, that you have to almost start again in working out who's taking charge or who's responsible. And this came out, the purpose of the funeral came out massively in the interviews, because a key disjuncture, and I don't think the Law Commission will be able to get to the bottom of this, but is who is a funeral for? And on the one hand, it is for the deceased person, it is a ritual to mark the ending of their life, and it is a moment to dispose of their body. And actually, the disposal of their body doesn't need to be ritualized. It is, but there is a sort of public health function. That body, something has to happen. But on the ritual side, they don't benefit from it. They don't. They had some benefit when they were alive, thinking that their wishes might be followed through, but they are not the beneficiaries, the recipients, the people who are going to obtain any value from any ritual activities. It is the living. And this is a really big problem. And we're just about to start a study on dying at home. And it's going to be the same problem, because it's about whose needs are being met here. And how do you determine whose needs are the most important? And the challenge is going to be, if you protect deceased people's funerary wishes, what are the costs and risks and harms potentially to their family and people who want to do things differently? And we had lots of cases like this for this person. AN, by the way, means at need. This person was an at need provider, and the most people are saying, about 90, 95%, 98% of cases, there is a clear sort of threading through of person who's died, and it's clear who takes responsibility for the funeral and so on. But for those small number of cases, which are growing, it's becoming increasingly unclear. And direct cremation is also sort of throwing a big bomb into it in terms of people having a lack of clarity about whose wish is the most important. What are the consequences of these decisions? Who has to live with the consequences of these decisions? And funeral directors were telling us that they're having to find workarounds. And that's part of that skill set. That is part of a really skillful mediatory, if that's a word, role, and finding creative solutions so that you're meeting multiple needs. And those needs are for a sense of honouring the deceased person and what they wanted, whilst also meeting the needs of the family and what other people and what people within the family might want, but also meeting the needs of the wider community with that performative element of a funeral and what other people might expect to happen after someone has died. And all of this is framed by values, and in terms of what is a useful thing to do, what is a good use of money, what are people's sense of obligation to one another, how much individual choice trumps everything. So if the deceased person has said that I want this, that is it, do you uphold that, even if it's going to come at great cost and harm to the family? And that is a real problem that's going to happen if deceased people's wishes are given some kind of protection. It will mean that there's very less opportunity to flex to meet other needs that may be occurring at that time. I can see questions coming in. I'm in full flow, if that's all right. I'm just going to keep going. In terms of funeral practice, what we found, and this is again no surprise, but particularly in the pre-need market, there is huge variation in what is being documented and what constitutes a wish. So this was a great quote from a pre-need provider, that they've got one lady who's got a file of an inch thick. She's got the poems, she's got the photos, she keeps tinkering with it. She has a very, very clear, it's very prescriptive. Doesn't really allow for much room for maneuver for the people who are implementing it, although, as we all know, technically at this point, they could just come in and say, we're not doing any of that. We're going to do something different. And then you've got people who are saying, using it more as like an insurance product. I'm just paying for it, they can decide what to do. And then you've got everything in between. And depending on the plan provider, there's lots of different variation in terms of what's being recorded. But as you know, all of that can be overridden. So, and I think this is a question for the Law Commission, is, well, what do you mean by wish. I don't know if they all particularly like that as a challenge, because it's really, where do you draw the line in terms of what a wish is? Is it just burial or cremation? Is that it? That's all you can do? Or is it actually about the ritual components? Is it about the type of coffin? Is it about the location of the burial or the cremation? Where would you say, actually, this is a reasonable wish and we can fulfill it, and this is an unreasonable wish? And within this, I can't remember if it's on a future slide, we will be making the case in this report that wishes have to be accompanied by provision. You cannot be passing on wishes and giving them some kind of legal protection, and putting the living in a position where they are undeliverable, either because of money or just because it's not feasible, or the crematorium is closed, it's being refurbished and you can't do it. So there will have to be some flex built into the system. This takes us on to, actually, what does it mean when you implement wishes? And the question of, it came out in quite a few interviews of people questioning whether the regulation of the pre-plan market was the right place to be regulating, because it's treating it as a financial product, whereas actually a funeral is much more than a financial product. It is a ritual, it is a family and community event, it serves various purposes for different people, and that is not covered by financial regulation. It's not like buying a mortgage, or taking out a mortgage, of shopping around and making these kind of calculations. It's actually it's got sort of lots of moral complexities built into it, and is used as a way of demonstrating commitment and loyalty and love and hatred and animosity. It's a very emotional experience. The question came up as well, are pre-need plans actually worth it? Are they worth making beyond making financial provision? Are they the best way of documenting wishes? Should it be in wills? So some of the questions that we were getting is, okay, so if you did, or we were asking, if you did protect people's wishes, how can you ensure that they are deliverable? How can you ensure they're found? How can you ensure that someone will be accountable for ensuring that they are delivered? And who's that person going to be? Is it going to be funeral directors who are held accountable, or is it going to be the family member who takes responsibility for the funeral, the client? There are no easy questions to that, and part of the problem, I mentioned it earlier, is that these systems don't talk to one another. So there is no requirement to search the pre-pay plan register. There is no requirement to search for wills. People can't even find them. So how do you actually document this and then create the mechanisms to actually ensure that wishes are carried out? And the question is a prepaid plan the place to do it, when it actually currently doesn't have any kind of legal status beyond it being a financial product? And a real challenge also that came out in interviews is that in an ideal world, you'd find all this out before you took someone on. In an ideal world, you would know about their background. You would know about, is this going to be a really complex case? Are there lots of warring people in the background? You might ask the question of, have you got the resources, to pay for the funeral? Some funeral directors said that they do ask that at the point of collection of the body, but others didn't. But the question of, it's very difficult to ask about warring families at the point at which you collect people and they go into your care or your custody. And that is a real problem, because you're entering into a transaction and a service provision without knowing the full picture. And it's I think the real challenge in funeral directing world is the risk of that. And that really came out in interviews as well, because when funeral directors take on a particularly complicated case and the family start wielding all sorts of accusations over social media, very big reputational damage, very big reputational risks. Some funeral directors have to say, look, you have to go elsewhere. Others had to get legal advice and it ended up costing them money. So and it's a very tricky one, because at the point at which you receive bodies, and there are ways to do it, is that you can refuse to take a person on until you have a bit more information, but then the risk will always be, well, someone else will come along and take that business. Mortuaries won't particularly want people sitting there for a long time. Hospices, care homes won't want people there a long time. Families won't want people in their homes for a long time. So you are on quite a tight turnaround to find out information, and that is not easy to recover. I can see that in someone has said it. This is not easy to find out some of this information, and it's very difficult to ask some of the questions. And that really came out in the interviews about the skill set required to navigate all this, and it is really complicated, and it doesn't get into the public domain. Most people don't know this goes on. They might encounter it later in life, but there is a lot of work to be done to make some of this visible, to show why, for some families, who particularly want a funeral, or who want to go against the deceased person's wishes, or moderate or adapt them in some way, that the skill set required to enable that to happen is really quite multifaceted, and that's the emotional labor involved. It's about asking the right questions. It's about always being on your guard. So quite a few interviewees talked about always being on your guard, having to be 2 steps ahead within the conversation, so you don't say the wrong thing, you don't inflame the situation, because you're constantly trying to not let it escalate, constantly trying to get it to progress. You don't want log jams, you don't want indecision. So that sense of pushing it back onto families and helping them to reach decisions. I mean, honestly, I have total respect for being able to do that, because your whole system is predicated on constant throughput. And I think one of the challenges that came out also in some of the interviews is that you don't have the time often to really get to know families, to really drill down into the bottom of things, to work out what they need and want, to then mediate between them all, and then meet their needs and the deceased person's, and ensure that you get paid at the end of it. Some providers can, but they charge a heck of a lot more, obviously, for that kind of bespoke service, and they're typically one-man bands who are providing that high degree of sort of input and relationship building. For the vast majority of people I spoke to, and my understanding of the sector is you just haven't got the time to do it. And that takes me to the final point of which I've said already, but there is minimal recognition of this in the healthcare, health and social care, in terms of what happens after death, in terms of public health, in terms of local authorities, I'm thinking any of the big government departments or policy areas. I don't see any of it reflected in public sort of language and discourse around the challenges of what happens after people die. But as we know, 600,000 people die a year across the UK. That is a lot of people. And people said this in the interviews, we're invisible, we're the 5th emergency service. It is, and oftentimes people don't ever want to see you. They don't want to see you again. And people said that in interviews. But I'm thinking about, well, how can you then find the advocates who can make that case on your behalf? How can you, because it's only when things go drastically wrong, like they have done in the last year or so, particularly with the whole situation, which I'm sure you're all sick of hearing about, but it's only when things go wrong that people start to sit up and pay attention. And so I suspect also what's coming with the whole thing, when it starts to go through criminal proceedings, is there'll be a lot more questions asked about funeral directors. And to me, I think that importance of the evidence base, and to be ready to combat that with why you need us, what we offer, is really important. And some of that needs to be I think things that will help you are things like consistency of language across the sector, so that people have a sense of clarity, and there's continuity if they're talking about different roles and responsibilities, different services. That you can have a bit more of an assumed shared knowledge about what people are talking about. I think there's much can be done to join the systems together. So when people, why not? Why can't you do, when you register a death? I don't know in terms of behind the scenes whether this is possible, but when the person registers the death, they have to check: is there registered will, or is there a plan? Something that then creates a pathway for the funeral to take place, and ultimately the disposal of the body. I think there needs to be much more public education on the responsibilities and what can happen after death, and on the risk and benefit of funeral choices. I don't see that there is a really good evidence base to show. There's a lot of bandied around about the risks of direct cremation, but the evidence is just not there. Um, and I think that would probably help massively in terms of the sector if you had more of a solid evidence base. And I think this is just rehashing what I've already said. So you're invisible. So it's about making it more visible, all this complexity behind the scenes. It's recognition of the skill set that's required to do this work, and the evidence. I think there needs to be more into evidence to show the relational work that goes on behind the scenes, the mediation. I think my view is stay away from the psychological benefits of funerals because that's iffy. But in terms of the evidence that's currently available, but there is certainly a need for evidence to show the benefits to people's relationships by having a funeral or having a funeral director who can mediate and find resolutions and find solutions that different people are happy with. I think that is really, really important. And thank you very much. I can't keep up with all the comments, so Terry, I don't know if you can help me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Kate. There's lots of things to digest. I wondered, actually, just picking up on the last point that you had about invisibility of funeral directors and their skills, and you talk about stay away from the psychological benefits of a funeral, which is kind of contrary to what we're thinking about. Tell me a bit more about why you say we shouldn't focus on that, but should focus on how we can bring mediator skill sets and benefit the relationships.
I think I'm saying that because of the work that has been done, that includes work by myself, but other people as well. There is no evidence, that a particular type of funeral will lead to a particular type of outcome, a better or worse outcome. And I think part of the problem is also because people have very different expectations of what a funeral can deliver and should deliver. And again, that's part of the problem. Is it about the deceased person and recognizing their end of their life, expressing grief, or is it about reconnecting with the living, re-establishing relationships, getting to know other people in the person's life that they've heard about for years but never actually met?
Yeah.
Does it have a purpose about the future rather than the past? So people are going into the funeral with very different expectations about what it does, what it can do, and if their expectations aren't being met, that will affect how positively they regard that experience, and that is very difficult to measure.
Yeah,
because you're not all coming from the same starting point, if that makes sense. So I think if you go down the psychological route, you've also got to explore what people's expectations were as well. And I think there is a lot more to be said, and in general, about the social network side of funerals and the connections that can be established or re-established, that can also help with grief and can also help with community and help with belonging. But maybe that's where the psychological benefit is.
yeah.
But it's about the relationships rather than the individual emotion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. On the subject of the taboo nature of death in society, you've talked about public education. Are there any calls to action for our funeral directors in terms of how, we've seen death cafes, that sort of thing. We've seen town hall events just to educate about funeral choices. Do you have any views on how, funeral directors engage in talking about death and end of life?
I think the challenge is that a lot of those public education campaigns and efforts like the death cafes, the death positivity movement, there's a whole death literacy stuff now. There's a lot of compassionate communities. They come from and are speaking to people who are usually well educated, have resources behind them, are quite secure and were probably able to self-advocate for what they wanted already.
Yeah.
I worry that a lot of that side of things misses all those other people who don't see themselves reflected, who are never going to go to a death cafe. They're just not. And I think that when I spoke to the people I spoke to, are doing fantastic things in terms of outreach, local outreach, to engage with different populations, particularly older people, more marginalized communities, to do tiny little bits of education in different ways. And that was fun. That was really impactful and effective. That's what I was getting from the interviews. I think the challenge then is, how do you make that bigger? How do you roll it out? Or how do you make that more visible?
Yes.
Don't stop it, but how do you then open it up?
And we know that John Adams has been leading a strong movement for bereavement education in secondary schools, and that's really important. Well, we've had a number of comments, particularly around the grief. So some are arguing actually what we're seeing is there is complex grief because of unattended funerals, and that our grief counsellors across our funeral homes are picking this up. There's a number. Are there any other questions that you want to pick up at all, Kate? The will issue, because there isn't a repository for wills, that's always going to be a challenge. And you mentioned in your presentation, it's 2 a.m. You can't ask, do you have authority? It's probably next day you will find out who has the authority to contract a funeral director in the family. Are there any solutions to the will issue?
I mean, it's outside of my knowledge in terms of how these systems work behind the scenes, but I think there are opportunities lost that you could require people to have a will. Like if you have a child, you have to have a will. So when you go and register their birth, you have to put a will in place. To ensure that eventually everyone has some kind of legal document about what will happen in the event of their death, because they are going to die. And because it's not being required, I don't know what people expect is going to happen. I honestly don't. I genuinely don't. All those people who don't have them. But then again, I talk about this all the time. I tell my husband on a quite regular basis my funeral wishes and what's changed. But I'm not your average person who doesn't engage with any of this. So I think in my ideal world is you would have mechanisms that mean that there is a baseline. You had clarity that you knew that eventually everyone was going to have something that you could call on. And just a couple of other things. A point about the grief and the national curriculum. In bereavement, one of the things that I think has been a real loss in the education world is having pets at school. So I remember having pets at primary school, and that was one of the key ways in which you talked about life cycles and life and death. And it was a very accessible way for children to understand that life ends. And because of I don't think animals are allowed in schools now. And so I think that the challenge is, if you force it in, it just comes, oh, it's just another thing we have to sit there and learn about. Oh, I don't want to do this. And I say that as a mother of young children who are turning into the stroppy teenagers. Well, they're tween. One of them is a tween. But if you find the ways in, that are gentler and a bit more less onerous, I think I think those opportunities have been lost, and I wonder how they could be brought back in. That was one thing. And the other thing about complicated grief and funeral attendance, I think the problem is, one of the big key challenges is a funeral is a one-off, and you can't if you, at the point at which the body is disposed of, you can't go back and redo it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know whether that person would have had a complicated experience, even if they'd had a funeral. And I think that also came out in interviews, is there are no guarantees of even having a funeral. Funerals can actually make things worse, because there is an assumption, not an unspoken assumption, that they do provide, they provide opportunities, they reconnect, they meet people's needs, but actually there are lots of times when they don't, and they are actually deeply distressing. They create more family conflicts. They are exhausting. They're not what people had hoped for. So I think it's got to be a bit careful about making those assumptions that not having a funeral is causing problems and a funeral would have helped.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I suppose my last question, if I can put it to you, is you talk about we need to evidence the value of funeral directors, their skill in harmonizing and getting the best out of a broken situation. What's your recommend? How would they do that? How do they promote that invisible skill?
Many years ago, I thought the funeral awards, the Good Funeral Awards, were a really good step forwards in it, because at least that was it was celebrating things. I don't know what's happened to them recently, although I saw some things happened. They've come. I don't know where things are. I think one of the big challenges you've got, and we wrote a paper about this years and years ago, is that as a sector, it's just an observation as an outsider. I work in higher education, which has got its own load of problems. You know, it's not like any sector is perfect, but can you ever come together and pool resources and make some of this public, and share it, and share good practice, and share challenges? And what we found in research that we did previously, that we've written about, is that often funeral directors and arrangers were unwilling to share problems because it opens them up to vulnerability and competitors. And that's a real challenge, I think, because that sharing of practice locally especially can be come with risks.
Kate, you've given us much food for thought. And if people want to interact with you, they can contact you, can't they, in terms of email? And we're going to talk further, perhaps have a report from you for our members. Thank you so much for what you brought to us today. I think it's really encouraging to hear of the good work of funeral directors that's unseen. And it's our task within the trade bodies to really begin to shout about that more as well. So
yeah, and amplify it. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. And like I said, I'm very happy to, so my email's online if you just search for me. I'm very happy to talk to people about this, but also come and share this work with other audiences. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks all. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.